Is there any evidence for the exodus of Israel coming out of Egypt? We'll check that out in the Forge. Hi, I'm Ron Matsen, and welcome to The Forge. This week we're going to be looking at the subject that has been brought up by a number of people concerning the historicity of the Bible, especially that for the Exodus. We have a question that came in from Molly from North Carolina. She writes, I'm a new Christian. My friends tell me that the stories in the Bible about the nation of Israel are all fiction. When I Googled the Exodus of Israel, I found many sites that said it's all fiction. Is there any hard evidence for the Exodus as told in the Bible? Well, let's first of all look at what we mean by the Exodus. There may be those of you that are watching this broadcast who aren't really familiar with the basis of this question. And so let me give you the background of what we're going to be looking at here. The nation of Israel had been in Egypt for 430 years, living primarily as slaves there. Then, because of Moses returning to the land, by the hand of the Lord, 10 plagues coming upon the nation of Egypt, God was preparing the nation of Israel to be freed from their captors. And on the 14th of Nisan, they had an event called the Passover, during which time the firstborn of every individual in every house in Egypt that did not have the blood of the lamb on the doorpost and the lintel, that family would lose its firstborn. Then the 14th became known as the beginning. In fact, the month of Nisan became the beginning of all religious observations. They camped together as they were exiting in a place that they referred to as Sukkoth or booths. It's in Exodus 12:37. And then they camped at Etham, which is referenced in Exodus 13:20. They then were on the edge of the wilderness, so they're ready to depart and go on this journey. They are now going to travel to the place of the crossing. At the place of the crossing, they come to a place where they turn in the wilderness. They camp before the mouth of the channel between mountains and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon, which means the God of the unknown. After the crossing, there's a 3-day journey. They come to a place where there's a bitter spring. Then they go on to a place called Elim, where there are 12 wells and 70 palms. They then go through the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. There's where they're given manna for the first time. And they arrive at Rephidim, where they receive water from a rock. They then camp at Mount Sinai at its base, where the mountain top is burnt. Boundary markers are set around the base of the mountain. There's an altar built by Moses and a golden calf built by the nation of Israel, led by the brother of Moses, Aaron. Then after that sin, there are many people in the nation of Israel that are buried there at the base of Mount Sinai. So let's just give you a perspective here in terms of where this all takes place. The kingdom of Egypt is covering what we know today as Egypt, including the Sinai Peninsula. The children of Israel are living in the land of Goshen. To their east is the land of the Philistines, and to the southeast of Egypt is the land of Midian. Now, there are many variations on the same theme. Israel made their way to the Sinai Peninsula. Most maps in the back of the Bible maintain this tradition, and perhaps you've seen a map something like this. It has various lines and directions and places, but what you'll have is you'll have the various options that are associated with these places. Now, Jebel Musa, the Mount Sinai, is there in the Sinai Peninsula. This is what it looks like. At the top of it is St. Catherine's Monastery. And this is the place by tradition that Moses is to have come and received the 10 Commandments. But yet, when we look at the evidence for it, in the March 9th, 2002 issue of the New York Times, Dr. Zawi Hawass, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities and Director of the Giza Pyramid Excavation, says this: archaeologists who have worked here have never turned up evidence to support the account in the Bible. We then have David Wolf. He's the rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, California. He's the assistant to the chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York. He is named one of the 50 most influential Jews in America. And this is what he said: 3 years ago on Passover, I explained to my congregation that according to archaeologists, there was no reliable evidence that the Exodus took place, and that it almost certainly did not take place the way the Bible recounts it. Finally, I emphasize it didn't matter. And so really, folks, what this comes down to is that which is out there, that which, as Molly found out, you do some Google searches here, and what you're going to find is that there's going to be many people that say, the experts say there's no evidence for this event. They all agree there's no evidence. But what does the Bible say? Well, first of all, we're going to look at some people who've actually done some exploration. We're going to look at some evidence that's brought into view by a man named Ron Wyatt. Also some discoveries made by Bob Cornuke, by Jim and Penny Caldwell, and finally we'll end with Dr. David Kim. Now again, let's get a perspective here that the traditional route is in the Sinai Peninsula. The route of Moses from Midian to Goshen, as he went there 40 years earlier, was a route which would have gone through the area of the Philistines. And so if we take that map that is common to many people and we look at it, we'll see that there are many different options in terms of the crossing. Some say it was the Reed Sea. Some say it was various small lakes that they crossed that have now dried up, of which they have no evidence. And others say perhaps it was the northern part of the Gulf of Suez. But then as you look at the map, you'll see it takes you to the first place that's mentioned in the Bible, that of Mara. And there's a question mark next to it. Why? Because there's nothing there that would indicate that this could have been the site. Then Elam, again, it's a place in your Bible that should have a question mark. Why? Because there's no evidence there that would indicate that this is where this event took place. And then, of course, the journey down to Mount Sinai, and if the map makers are honest, they're going to be giving you a map with a question mark because there is no evidence on the Sinai Peninsula for the Exodus of Israel. See, here's the problem or the trouble with tradition. There's no archaeological evidence ever found along the traditional route. There's no geographical evidence that's present. And yet we know that the Bible clearly says that God made a pathway in the sea. Exodus 15:8 says, with the blast of your nostrils, the waters were gathered up. The flood stood upright like a heap. The depths congealed in the heart of the sea. And so what we have here is we have a direct contradiction between what the Bible is telling us as history and that which the world is looking at, assuming the traditions of the church and Israel have been correct. Now, in fact, the dividing of the Red Sea is something that is proof positive for many of the ways in which God authenticates his calling of the nation of Israel. We see that in Psalm 66, 74, 77, 104, 106, and Nehemiah 9. These are prime references to this event where God leads the nation of Israel out of Egypt through this pathway in the sea to the land of Midian. And so we're all familiar with these images, but are they just images? See, the trouble with tradition is that the northern Sinai Peninsula had an Egyptian military presence at the time that the Exodus should take place. And Moses was returning to Mount Horeb, Sinai, which is in Midian. We find that in Exodus chapter 3. And after all, the Bible even gives us a clue that most people have just forgotten, and that is in Galatians. Paul writes, chapter 4, verse 25, "For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." In Arabia. Get that? The Bible clearly says that the tradition of man looking in the Sinai Peninsula is the wrong place. No wonder that there's no evidence there that would corroborate and substantiate this claim that the Bible makes. So let's take another look at this. First of all, as we look at this area, we recognize that the Red Sea has to the north of it two gulfs, the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. Both of them are part of the Red Sea. To the east of the Gulf of Aqaba is this area of Midian. There's plenty of ancient writings and things that would make it very clear that this is the land of Midian. So this is the land that they are targeting. This is the land that Moses came from. This is the land that God is taking them back to. Now, when we consider the place of the crossing, we need to also consider the issue of the timing of the crossing. From Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, we know that it was about 48 days for them to arrive at Mount Horeb, or Sinai, and that it was about 30 days for them to arrive at Midian, chapter 16 of Exodus. Therefore, it took about 25 days from the time they left, the 14th of Nisan, till the time they arrive at the place of the crossing, about 25 days. Now, if we look at the Red Sea, the Red Sea itself has a maximum depth of 9,000 feet. If we look at the Gulf of Suez, we see the average width of it is 20 miles across. That's a day's journey at least. And the depth is 200 to 300 feet. The Gulf of Aqaba is narrower, 8 to 17 miles across, but the depth is less than 2,000 feet. Some places to 4,600 feet. Now, there's four key descriptions that describe the place of the crossing. We read in the first two verses of chapter 14 that they turned from, that is Etham, and they camped before Pi-Hahiroth, which means mouth of the channel, between Migdol and the sea, which means between a tower or tall mountains and the sea, opposite Baal-Zephon, which means the god of the north or the god of the unknown. And so very specific, if we look at that description against the geography here, we'll see that it eliminates the traditional pathway that you find in most Bibles. So if we take a look at the Reed Sea or even the northern Suez view, neither one of those satisfy this 25-day journey ending at a place which was the mouth of an opening to the sea. We're going to look at a suggestion by Ron Wyatt, which is Nueba, and also that of Bob Cornuke, which is the Straits of Tiran. And we're going to examine those now in a little bit of detail. First of all, Nueba. Nueba is a place which is on the western shore of the Gulf of Aqaba. And Ron Wyatt's view is that as the nation of Israel were going across the top of the Sinai Peninsula, they came to a place where rather than carry on toward the Philistines, they turned south. And that was a tactical error because it would have put them on the wrong side of the Gulf of Aqaba. And they came out to a place which is now known as Nueba. And it is a unique place. It's a large sandbar. It could easily handle 1 million or 2 people. It is surrounded by water, and people who would end up there certainly would be trapped. There's another feature about this area that's important for us to recognize, and that is between the western and eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, there at Nueba, there is an underwater land bridge, and that has been well documented as a land bridge between, which means the depth of water there is less than the rest of the Gulf of Aqaba. He also found a large column on the Sinai Peninsula side, no inscription on it, but Ron did make the claim that when he traveled to Saudi Arabia, he found an identical pillar like this on the Saudi Arabian sign with Paleo-Hebrew writing on it, which said this is the place of the crossing. Now, unfortunately, according to Ron, that has been moved and it's in hiding or it's been destroyed, but nonetheless, there's been no independent verification of that. He also brought out the fact that he believed that he had discovered some artifacts along this land bridge which looked like chariot wheels, and there was quite a bit of excitement on the internet as this began to come out. These perhaps were artifacts from the drowned Pharaoh army. He even made reference to one of the chariot wheels being golden. Well, the problem with all of this, with this declaration by Ron Wyatt, is there's no independent verification at all of any of the artifacts. No one's gone there and been able to verify what he claims he saw. It doesn't mean that it's not true. It just means that the evidence that he's making reference to is no longer available for anybody to verify. Now let's look at the second option that was presented by explorer Bob Cornuke. Bob Cornuke takes the view that the children of Israel would have traveled down the western side of the Sinai Peninsula and that they would have found themselves trapped as they turned at the end of the Sinai Peninsula in this area of Tehran, and there is a large mountain range there that would have prevented them from going any further. There is also there in this area between the tip of the Straits of Tehran and the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, there is also a land bridge. And so when we look especially at these four key descriptions, they turn, meaning turn in the wilderness, at the mouth of the channel, where they have a mountain or a fortress to the one side of them and the sea on the other. And it's at the mouth where there was this perhaps reference to this God of the unknown, because it went out into the wide ocean at that point. Now, if we take a closer look at this underwater land bridge that Bob believes is there, we do see some evidence of it. In fact, if you go to it today and you are there during low tide, you will see that there are a series of these coral reefs that do stretch from the Sinai Peninsula there at the Straits of Tehran across to Saudi Arabia. And in fact, there are pictures of individuals standing on these reefs when the water subsides. Now, I'm not suggesting that the reefs that are there now were there very conveniently at the time of the Exodus. I'm just simply saying that the land bridge that's there is there in a manner that the coral could have built up upon it. But certainly it's a provocative alternative to the solutions in the traditional Exodus pathway. And so as we look at the destination, our objectives, we see that we need to understand that the objective is Mount Horeb and Midian, not the Sinai Peninsula, and that we've identified at least two possible crossings, places for crossing there the Red Sea. Now, the narrative then tells us that they traveled 3 days and they came to springs that had bitter water. Now, if we start from the Straits of Tehran crossing and we measure a 3-day journey, it turns out, if we stay along the Red Sea, that there are, in fact, there even today, bitter springs. And so I think, at least in terms of evidence, that is something to consider as a possible answer to the question, is there any evidence for that? Then we are told in the narrative that they went on to Elam, where there were 12 wells and 70 palms. Again, we travel a short distance and we come to the city of Al-Makna. Al-Makna has an area where there are 12 ancient wells, and it still services the local area as being a spring for fresh water. And so still there today, ancient springs. Yet again, we see what might be, at least in terms of the biblical narrative, a narrative that follows in a logical pattern. We are then told that they traveled through the wilderness of sin. Now, sin doesn't mean sin is wrongdoing. It's a term. There are three wildernesses that are referred to in Scripture during this journey. And this is the wilderness of sin, which means the wilderness of thorns. And so if we look at Elam, and we're going to what we believe is Mount Horeb, we will travel to the east. And the scriptures say that the wilderness of sin is between Elam and Mount Horeb. And so there is a channel through the mountains, a pathway that you can go that brings you to this point. On the other side of this, we'll look at a little later in this presentation, is what I believe could be where the camp of Israel was at the base of Mount Sinai. Now, along the way, if they take this route, they would have gone by or near the city of Al-Bad. Al-Bad is interesting because when you go there today, it's in an area that the locals refer to as Midian. It's also referred to as the city of Jethro. And if you remember your biblical history, you know that the father-in-law of Moses was Jethro. And he lived with Jethro for 40 years, and he has quite an interplay with him even on his return here, the city of Jethro. And there are some interesting ruins just north and east of the city. There are actually a series of caves which are referred to as the caves of Jethro. Now, these are not Jews or Christians going there naming these places this. This is what the local Arabs call these caves. Why? Because apparently there are some writings on the inside that describe them as the caves of Jethro. There's also an ancient well close to this area, which the locals refer to as the Well of Moses. And so if you go to the people that are living there, they address it as the city of Jethro and the Well of Moses. So this would have been the area that Moses was returning to, the place that he left when he went to be with his brethren in Egypt. And so now the evidence is beginning to build a little bit here. Notice we've been able to identify at least two viable places that have some evidence for the crossing of the Red Sea. We've seen some bitter springs. We've seen a place where there are 12 wells. It's an ancient city. They traveled through the wilderness of sin. Then during this time, they're given manna, and they're taken to a place called Rephidim, where they drink water from a rock. Now, this is going to be more difficult, you would think. Well, let's just take a look. If we look at this journey, we recognize that Rephidim, the very name of it means a place of rest. Now, that's a strange thing when you consider that this is one of the most hostile places on the planet to live. It has less than 1/4 inch of rain every 10 years. It's virtually impossible for anyone to live there. In fact, archaeologists tell us that no one has lived there permanently. And yet it'll be against that fact that we will look at some very provocative evidence. For Psalm 78 tells us concerning the event that takes place there, he split the rock in the wilderness, gave them drink in abundance like the depths. He also brought out streams of the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. There was a couple that lived in Saudi Arabia for more than a dozen years and made many trips to this area. They were there working with the Aramco Arab American Oil Company, and every year they would take a vacation, and many of those vacations were to this area. They were one of the early explorers of it, and they were the ones that discovered this peculiar rock that's there just before Mount Horeb. In fact, when you look at this using Google Earth, you'll see the rock there, and you'll see this shadow. And it's been measured to be about 60 feet tall. But notice the interesting fissure in the rock. It's equidistant from top to bottom. And at the very base of the rock, there's some very interesting water flaking. This is not typical for this area, primarily because there's not very much water. The water flaking is so different to anything else on any of the other rocks in the area. In fact, the rocks coming down from it look as though a river of water has flown from it. Now, another thing that's interesting about this area is to recognize that while the Caldwellers are there, they spent many days searching, going back and forth. They camped there apparently. They found dozens and dozens and dozens of these glyphs, these writings on rocks around the lake bed, this dried lake bed that was there. And notice they're a symbol of a foot in a sandal. And some believe that perhaps what was taking place there is that this was the nation of Israel reacting to the fact that God had told them when they come into the promised land, he would give them whatever land they put their foot on. And so some have supposed that perhaps these flat stones with these sandal symbols might have been an early attempt to make property markers. Don't know, but there's no other justification for them. Again, this is not a place that there was ever a city or people dwelling here for any period of time that we know in secular history. But we see these sandal marks there. We also see around the place apparently dozens and dozens of these mortar and pestle type devices. It's believed that they were either for grounding wheat or possibly they were there for the dealing with manna. They talked about this manna that came. They did various things with it. And so, again, these are two things around this lake bed that are unusual. They shouldn't be there. And certainly they beg the question, who would have made them, for what purpose, and when did they leave them there? And so as we look at our list of things I think we have a little bit of evidence for, we can see the evidence beginning to grow. Certainly this split rock at Rephidim is certainly provocative. But let's carry on. We are told that they camp at the base of Mount Sinai. Again, as we take a look at our map, if we go around Mount Sinai, we come to an interesting area. It's about a mile wide, and in it are some very provocative archaeological sites, new archaeological sites. There's large fenced-off areas. There's considerable amount of digging going on, and the discovery of what looks like early dwelling structures. The Bible also says that this needs to be in the area where there is a mountaintop that has been burnt. Now, that's not something you see every day. And yet it was Bob Cornuke who traveled to this area and brought back the first photographic evidence that we have of Mount Sinai looking from the east where the camp of Israel might have resided, looking up at the mountain. And this dark facet to the top of the mountain is not a shadow. It's not something done in Photoshop. There have been many people who have now traveled to this area, taken a similar photograph. And if you want to check it out, just go to this area, look on Google, and look at pictures, and you'll see that there's more than a dozen different people who've traveled there and have affirmed the fact that the top of that mountain near what might be the ancient camp of Israel, the rock up there has the appearance as being burnt. And so we have this burnt line, very unique, very different. But we're also told in the biblical record that as God's presence is there, there is to be boundary markers. And in an area where there's never been a city, there's never been that they know of historically, in the history of the Saudi Arabian area, yet there are these strange boundary markers at the foot of the mountain. And they're all over the place. And it's believed these could begin to satisfy the commandment of God to build 12 pillars at the base of the mountain so that the 12 tribes of Israel would not trespass on the mountain. And so we begin to see there's some evidence there that at least goes with the biblical narrative. There's also in our narrative a reference to an altar built by Moses. We read in Exodus 24:4, "And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose up early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel." Well, if we take a look at the camp of Israel in this area, and we look to the west of it, and we look down, we'll notice that there is this unique V-type structure there in the ground. You can see it using Google Earth. A closer photograph of it begins to show this V-type structure. And in fact, it was the Saudi Arabian Department of Archaeology that diagrammed it for us. They actually describe it as being 25 meters across. There's an ancient ash pit, and they say that it could be a quarry, a residence, or an altar. Well, since we know that the cultures living in this area of Saudi Arabia never practiced burnt offerings, it would be unusual to have a substantial ash pit next to just a dwelling, and it certainly wasn't used for worship. So yet again, we have this altar which certainly satisfies the description that we get from the biblical narrative. And its location is way away from any residence. It's not in the middle of some occupied area. It's all on its own. We are then told in the biblical narrative that the children of Israel, when Moses is spending 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, that the children of Israel grow weary, and so they make this golden calf and make an altar for it. If we take a look at the camp of Israel that we've identified, there is a structure there, a man-made structure. It is surrounded by a chain-link fence today. You can see it from Google Earth. It's a man-made structure. You need to appreciate also something about an altar that God asked the children of Israel to make. They are never to make an altar with hewn stones. In other words, they have to just be native stones. They're not to use a hammer or chisel on that. And so this is quite a sizable altar. It's surrounded by a fence. But what's amazing is you look at this altar, and the altar is surrounded with these petroglyphs, these images of oxen. Now, if you know anything about Egypt, you know that the highest deity that the Egyptians worshipped was that of the Apis bull. And we also know that in Saudi Arabia, there were no religious cults or groups that worshipped any bovine characters. And so it's peculiar that these bovine petroglyphs would be there on these rocks. And in fact, one of the rocks that has these features on it has 12 of these writings on the side of this man-made altar. 12 of these. Very interesting. When you look at the lineup of that golden calf altar, the altar of Moses, and then up to Mount Sinai, you can see that this begins to stack up as some very convincing evidence. But then we have the final thing, which we should be able to find some sort of evidence, and that is the Bible tells us that when the children of Israel rebelled against God and built this altar, when Moses came down, he was furious. But God had instructed him that he wasn't going to take them away as a nation, invalidating his promise to take them into the promised land, but he did cause them to be punished. And as a result, Moses went down, he took the gold calf, he ground it, made a potion for the people to drink, and thousands of people died as a result of this judgment upon the nation of Israel. Well, it turns out that there is a man by the name of Dr. David Kim. He's the former personal physician to the king of Saudi Arabia for 16 years. And he was allowed at his retirement to take items from the archaeological dig around Jebel al-Al. So that's what the Saudi Arabians refer to as the mountain that we are referring to here, where they found more than 3,000 graves. And it was Dr. Kim who, in further researching this area, having traveled to this area many times, began to discover that there were all kinds of these glyphs in the rock around the area. And one, interestingly enough, was the symbol of the Jewish menorah. Now, that would clearly indicate that at some point there was a significant Jewish presence there. And in fact, when you look at the artifacts that he brought back, there are many of these artifacts that seem to indicate that there was a Jewish burial ground there. He brought back an image of an old man, a clay image, but on the bottom of that image, again, the symbol of a menorah, the symbol of a woman with a symbol on the back of a menorah, a symbol of another old man with embedded in its base the symbol of a menorah. Now, folks, this would have been around this gravesite. This would have been a way for the surviving relatives to perhaps immortalize or recognize their dearly departed loved ones. And so it's something that is quite compelling. He also found an artifact which has 4 Arabic letters on it. It has 2 on the front, 2 on the back. On the back, it has the letters Y and H. And on the front, H and W. If you take that together, those are the Hebrew consonants, which means the name of God, the YHWH. He also makes reference to the fact that there was lots of jewelry found there, gold jewelry. Remember, this is a graveyard in an area where no one has been before. They can't attribute any civilization living there other than these peculiar finds of these boundary markers, these grave sites, the residual artifacts of houses there, or at least the bases to tents. And now we have these gold artifacts which are sizable. And so, you know, when you take a look at the evidence that these 4 groups of people have brought us, they certainly deserve a closer inspection rather than just simply taking the word of individuals who are looking at the traditional site. Instead, we need to look at the destination is in Midian, that there are 2 places where they could have crossed the Red Sea, and that if you cross at Tehran, a 3-day journey takes you to a place where there are even today bitter springs. Then a short journey beyond that is a place of Elam where there is today 12 ancient wells. Then you can go through the wilderness of Sin and go to the place of Rephidim where there is this split rock that was found by the Caldwells. You can then travel around to the base of Mount Sinai, and you can look up and take your own photograph of the burnt mountain. You can witness the boundary markers that are there. You can walk up and see the altar of Moses. You can stand outside of the gate that's there, the fence of the golden calf altar. And you can see the evidence that Dr. Kim has brought back of people who were buried there of some influence, and certainly many of them familiar with the symbols of Judaism. Is there any evidence for the Exodus? Well, we'll let you decide that. And until next time, Thanks for joining us in the Forge. At its base, where the mountain top is burnt, boundary markers are set around the base of the mountain. There's an altar built by Moses and a golden calf built by the nation of Israel, led by the brother of Moses, Aaron. Then after that sin, there are many people in the nation of Israel that are buried there at the base of Mount Sinai. So let's just give you a perspective here in terms of where this all takes place. The kingdom of Egypt is covering what we know today as Egypt, including the Sinai Peninsula. The children of Israel are living in the land of Goshen. To their east is the land of the Philistines, and to the southeast of Egypt is the land of Midian. Now, there are many variations on the same theme. Israel made their way to the Sinai Peninsula. Most maps in the back of the Bible maintain this tradition, and perhaps you've seen a map something like this. It has various lines and directions and places, but what you'll have is you'll have the various options camped together as they were exiting in a place that they referred to as Sukkoth or booths. It's in Exodus 12:37. And then they camped at Etham, which is referenced in Exodus 13:20. They then were on the edge of the wilderness, so they're ready to depart and go on this journey. They are now going to travel to the place of the crossing. At the place of the crossing, they come to a place where they turn in the wilderness. They camp before the mouth of the channel between mountains and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon, which means the God of the unknown. After the crossing, there's a 3-day journey. They come to a place where there's a bitter spring. Then they go on to a place called Elim, where there are 12 wells and 70 palms. They then go through the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. There is where they're given manna for the first time. And they arrive at Rephidim, where they receive water from a rock. They then camp at Mount Sinai, as told in the Bible. Well, let's first of all look at what we mean by the Exodus. There may be those of you that are watching this broadcast who aren't really familiar with the basis of this question. And so let me give you the background of what we're going to be looking at here. The nation of Israel had been in Egypt for 430 years, living primarily as slaves there. Then, because of Moses returning to the land, by the hand of the Lord, 10 plagues coming upon the nation of Egypt, God was preparing the nation of Israel to be freed from their captors. And on the 14th of Nisan, they had an event called the Passover, during which time the firstborn of every individual in every house in Egypt that did not have the blood of the lamb on the doorpost and the lintel, that family would lose its firstborn. Then the 14th became known as the beginning. In fact, the month of Nisan became the beginning of all religious observations. They came. Is there any evidence for the exodus of Israel coming out of Egypt? We'll check that out in the Forge. Hi, I'm Ron Matsen, and welcome to The Forge. This week we're going to be looking at the subject that has been brought up by a number of people concerning the historicity of the Bible, especially that for the Exodus. We have a question that came in from Molly from North Carolina. She writes, I'm a new Christian. My friends tell me that the stories in the Bible about the nation of Israel are all fiction. When I Googled the Exodus of Israel, I found many sites that said it's all fiction. Is there any hard evidence for the Exodus that are associated with these places? Now, Jebel Musa, the Mount Sinai, is there in the Sinai Peninsula. This is what it looks like. At the top of it is St. Catherine's Monastery. And this is the place by tradition that Moses is to have come and received the Ten Commandments. But yet, when we look at the evidence for it, in the March 9th, 2002 issue of the New York Times, Dr. Zawi Hawass, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities and Director of the Giza Pyramid Excavation, says this: archaeologists who have worked here have never turned up evidence to support the account in the Bible. We then have David Wolf. He's the rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, California. He's the assistant to the chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York. He is named one of the 50 most influential Jews in America. And this is what he said. 3 years ago on Passover, I explained to my